Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you're doing well. This is Martin Murphy from the ILO Department of Communications. We're here to launch the fourth edition of the ILO Monitor on COVID-19 and the world of work. With us are ILO Director General Guy Ryder and Mr. Sang-Jun Lee, the Director of the Employment Department at the ILO. You will have received a revised press release just to make sure that you have the latest one in front of you. It's one that reads more than 1 in 6 youth out of work due to COVID-19 in the headline. The new PDF is being sent to you right now, so you will receive it shortly. And just a few house rules before we begin. If you could add the name of your outlet next to your name, so we know who's speaking when I call on you. All your mics will be muted throughout the press conference, and we'll unmute you when you have the floor. And if you can please raise your hand, the little hand icon, to indicate that you want to ask a question. We have quite a few of you. We'll try to get to everyone. And the press conference will be done in English. You're welcome to put your questions in French, but the answers will be in English. So let me pass it on to the Director General, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So DG, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, and greetings to all our colleagues from the media. Thank you for joining us today for the launch, as Martin has said, of our fourth edition of the ILO COVID-19 Monitor. As I think you're probably aware, with these successive editions of the Monitor, what we've tried to do is to provide you with an overview of the overall impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the world of work, with a particular and consistent focus on the impact on employment. And I want to begin by updating you on that impact, what the job situation looks like around the world in this second quarter of the year. And then we've always focused in on some thematic questions that we consider merit particular attention. And in this monitor, we'll be looking at the situation of young people on labor markets, and also the importance of testing and tracing policies and their link to labor market outcomes. So firstly, update on the overall negative jobs impact of the pandemic. And here I have to say that the headline figure remains the same as the one we gave you some 3 weeks ago in the third edition of the Monitor. That is to say that on the basis of a calculation of the reduction in hours actually being worked in the world, the loss is the equivalent of 305 million full-time employment posts. That is the same figure that we gave you in the third monitor, although we've arrived at that figure on a slightly different basis because the actual reduction in working hours is now estimated at 10.7%, previously 10.5%. But we've also had to adjust for the baseline figure, which has now moved. So the overall figure is still at 305 million. Some regional variations behind that total. As perhaps you would not be surprised to hear, it is now the Americas where we see the greatest job loss. And I think this coincides with the fact that the WHO is now telling us that the Americas today constitutes the epicenter of the pandemic. So we see the relationship played out in the regional job losses. Those are the headline figures, and of course we can elaborate upon them as you wish in the questions that you may wish to put. And then let me go immediately to the situation of young people in the world of work. Let me begin by saying that had I been talking to you in advance before the pandemic hit us, I would be telling you about the disadvantaged, sometimes dramatic situation of young people in the world's labor markets. The youth unemployment pre-pandemic was higher still in the end of 2019 than it was even before the financial crisis of 2008. Young people continue to be concentrated in vulnerable jobs, 75% of them in the informal sector. There are a very high proportion of young people who are the so-called NEETs. They're not in employment, they're not in training. So we started already from a situation of great hardship and extreme vulnerability for young people. Now, what has happened since, I'm afraid, makes matters considerably worse. Perhaps the most important conclusion in our monitor is that of young people who were working prior to the pandemic, well, more than 1 in 6 of those young people is now no longer working. They have been basically ejected from their jobs. Those who are still working have suffered a major reduction in their working time of some 23%. So we see that the job hit, which I've described to you in global context, has been felt most sharply by young people who have been hit hardest and quickest. But even that does not tell us the full story, colleagues, because we see other factors at work which lead us to conclude that there is very serious concern for what happens post-pandemic. In the first instance, we have seen on the basis of survey work which is set out in the monitor that there has been a very abrupt and very large-scale interruption in education and training of young people around the world. The survey results that you will see show that a very high proportion of vocational and training institutions have stopped work. There has been some migration of training activities to online training. Of course, that's not available to everybody, and low-income countries are the least able to make that migration successfully. But the outcome of this interruption of training is that our survey shows us that some 10% of young people now doubt that they will be able to complete their education and training, and half of young people think that there's going to be considerable delay at the minimum in the completion of that training. And this interruption of the skills pipeline, I think, has serious long-term consequences. And the third element of this negative situation for young people relates to the fact that in conditions of pandemic, indeed in conditions of any recession, it is particularly difficult for young people to get their first foothold in the labor markets. That very difficult transition from education to the world of work becomes problematic. And that is doubly the case today. People are not moving into the labor market. We'll see school and college leavers coming onto the labor markets right now, frankly, into labor markets which are to a large extent closed down. That leads us to be extremely concerned both for the welfare of young people. The evidence which is available shows that probably in excess of half of young people are today vulnerable to anxiety and depression. There is a strong mental health side to this pandemic, and there is a danger of long-term exclusion. The scarring of young people who are excluded from the labor market early in their careers is well attested by the literature, and so I don't think it is giving way to hyperbole to talk about the danger of a lockdown generation to whom we must give particular attention in the many challenges that we will face as we exit this pandemic. So that's in the broad lines, a situation in respect of young people. The second theme that we've looked at, and I think there is good reason for it, is the issue of testing and tracing. I think you're all aware, colleagues, that the World Health Organization, our colleagues and neighbors here in Geneva, emphasizing the great importance of testing and tracing, case identification in containing and combating the virus. And that, of course, is a matter of good health policy. What we wanted to do in the monitor is to test the relationship between testing and tracing and labor market outcomes. And what you will see is that there is a clear statistical relationship established in the monitor between these two elements. This is to say that where there is rigorous and intense testing and tracing in place, labor market outcomes have been more positive. To put it with numbers, in those countries where there has been the most intensive testing and tracing, job reductions has been around the 7 hours reductions, excuse me, has been around the 7% mark, whereas in the least intensive testing and training countries, that is testing and tracing country, that figure goes up to 14%. All of this around that global average of about 10.7. So you see that there is that statistical relationship, which even controlling for other variables seems to us to be very significant. We don't try, or we aren't able in that statistical relationship to identify clearly the causal relationship, why the testing produces these good labor market outcomes, but we offer some possible explanations through 3 channels of causality. The first we call the public health channel. That is to say that where countries are operating strong testing and tracing policies, the need to intensify or prolong lockdowns of working places is correspondingly reduced, and that leads to labor market benefits. Secondly, this is the public confidence channel. Where testing and tracing is available, this helps to promote the confidence of economic actors, be they consumers, be they investors, be they enterprise managers. There is a greater confidence, and we know that this level of confidence will be extremely important as we move forward in coming out of this pandemic. And the third channel is workplace operational channels. That is to say, where the knowledge that results from testing and tracing is available, it is that much easier to manage the potential disruption at workplaces as we reopen. So these are 3, I think, credible explanations of why this statistical relationship exists. We recognize in the report that there are 2 further considerations to be taken into account in respect of testing and tracing. The first, obviously, is the question of cost. There is a cost associated with these policies. Where countries have been able to assume that cost, it is quite clear to us that this is a good return on a wise investment. That is to say, the economic benefits resulting from investment in testing and tracing is considerable. That is not to say that all countries are able to make that investment. And here again, to repeat a message that we have been reiterating consistently through the pandemic, there really is a need for international assistance and solidarity so that lower income countries whose financial and technical capacities may be limited are helped to put in place this type of response to the pandemic. And lastly, we do have to be cognizant as well of the data privacy issues that are connected to the use of this type of policy. Not a new issue for the world of work, let me say. As early as 1997, the ILO issued guidelines on a code of conduct, I should say, on the issue of data privacy in the world of work. Many of the considerations that we laid out in 1997 are applicable to our current circumstances. And I think that is a point that also has to be underlined. Colleagues, those are the major points that I wanted to highlight for you from the Monitor. I'm here to answer your questions, and so is the lead author of the Monitor, my colleague Sang-Yeon Lee, and we will do our best to respond to the comments and questions that you have. So thank you for your attention. Back to you, Martin.
Thank you, DG. So let's open it up to questions. Now, let me first go to Emma Farge from Reuters. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for that overview. I was just wondering if it's possible to get a clear number on youth unemployment, the unemployment rate before and after the COVID-19 crisis, please. And secondly, would it be possible to elaborate a bit more on how the United States is being impacted in terms of job losses? Thank you.
Okay, let me just give you a couple of general responses, and I'm going to pass over to my colleague Sang-Yeon to give you the more detailed responses on general unemployment figures for youth. I think we're not there yet. I think that full statistics are not available. For some countries, we have some figures, and I'd ask Sang-Yeon to convey them to you. And perhaps also on the United States question. I mean, what we know is that we've seen a very abrupt rise in unemployment in the United States. In my mind, it's 14.7%, the highest levels seen since the depression of the 1930s. But again, I'm going to ask my colleague to perhaps give you a fuller response on these matters. Sang-Yeon.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. On the youth unemployment, as actually Director General indicated, we are not in the position yet to actually produce the global estimate for youth unemployment, simply because of the lack of data. But we recently start to receive some very helpful information from typically from the advanced countries like the Canada and the US, and also the Netherlands and Switzerland and Korea and Japan. All of them are indicating clearly that the young people are being hit harder and faster in terms of the labor market opportunities. In some cases, like the US and the Canada, the incidence of the increases in the youth unemployment is much higher. So even sometimes more than twice than the for other age group, for example, prime at the age group. So I think all the evidence we received so far is indicating the really grave situation for the young people in terms of the labor market opportunities. And so the ILO Monitor will continue to actually trace actually the situation, and then we promise to update the figures as soon as we are in the position to do so. And the second question is about U.S. job losses. Yeah, that's key, very difficult, the question. Our analysis is pretty much in line with what actually official statistics has indicated so far. We know the US, for example, the total number of the job loss claim for last 3 weeks is more than already 40 million. And at the same time, we also know the total unemployment in the US, as reported by the BLS very recently, it's more than 20 million. This is pretty much close to what actually the estimate indicating in terms of the working hour losses and also the full-time equivalent. But what actually is a bit worrisome from the perspective of ILO Monitor is that in other countries, there seems to be some indication that a bit of very modest recovery from the most difficult situation as the countries moving away from the more strict lockdown measures to a bit softer types of the measures. But right now in the US, the situation seems to continue to be difficult, which may have a bit of the short-term and much stronger impacts on the labor market. That's something we're trying to monitor very carefully in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Sang-Yeon. Let me now go to Laurent Sierro from the Swiss News Agency, please. You have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the press conference. You mentioned the cost of test and tracing. Should the employers also pay a part of it, or is it just a task for the public authorities, according to you? And then also on the employers, you raised several times in the recent weeks the importance of safe conditions to turn to work after the lockdowns. When you see the American president, who is an employer in a way, who is the only one not wearing a mask at the White House, what's your comment on that? And do you have the impression that the employers more broadly make their part in that exemplary behavior that needs to be seen for safe conditions to work?
Okay, well, let me respond to that. On the costs of testing and tracing, we haven't taken, the ILO has not expressed a position in that regard of whether the private sector should be contributing. I think in the first instance, we regard this as a public policy question, a public health policy question, and I think that's where the response needs to come from. Clearly, there is an interest from employers. There's no doubt about that in this type of policy being carried out. And it may be in certain circumstances that it would be possible or appropriate for employers to contribute in one way or another to carrying out what is often quite a testing, quite a difficult process to put in place. But this is primarily a public policy question. We have, when it comes to the safe conditions of return to work, we have published, the ILO has published guidelines on what we consider to be the conditions for a safe return to work, and that is and will remain our views on the matter. I think there is a natural tension. Let me put it no more strongly than that. There's a natural tension. I don't think it is to be something to be surprised at between wanting to get economies moving again, wanting to get enterprises back into production on the one hand, and on the other hand, the consideration of wanting to make sure there is absolute priority given to safety and well-being of workers. I have to say that my experience is that the vast majority of cases, there is a meeting of minds through processes of dialogue. Employers and workers are working out these things in a sensible and appropriate way. I'm not going to make a comment on the particular behavior of any of the heads of government, heads of state, of any of the ILO's members, simply to draw attention again, and this applies to everybody, of the recommendations that the ILO has already published.
Thank you. Let's now go to Jamil Shade from Estado de São Paulo, please.
Thank you, Martin. Mr. Ryder, good to see you. Mike, since you mentioned numbers of the US, I will ask you about numbers of Brazil. And obviously the situation when you mentioned in your report that South America has had the largest revision of hours lost since your third evaluation. Could you comment on South America and Brazil specifically? Thank you.
Well, I'll make a general comment to the question, and then perhaps Sang-Young can fill in the details. Yeah, it is clear from the statistics we presented in this fourth monitor that the Americas has now jumped from being, when we first started measuring these effects, the region, along with Africa, that was the least affected in labor market terms by the impact of the pandemic, is jumped from being one of the least affected to now being the most affected. So, you know, I don't think there's a mystery about why that should be the case. It is precisely because, as the World Health Organization is telling us today and this week, precisely because the Americas has now become the epicenter of the pandemic. This relationship is clear. There are worries, as Dr. Tedros has said, about the fact that the pandemic now does seem to be impacting with increasing severity lower and middle income countries, about the capacities of those countries to put in place the right sorts of measures, both to contain the virus from its health aspect, but also to put in place the right types of world of work responses. And clearly in the Americas, where half of workers are in the informal economy, where frankly processes of social dialogue in many countries are not very effective right now and not working smoothly, there are major challenges. And I'm afraid the levels of infection that we're seeing, Brazil very tragically seems to be amongst the most infected countries in the world right now. There is good reason to be concerned both about the trajectory of the pandemic and the capacity to put in place the right sorts of measures to react to it. You've mentioned Brazil specifically, but clearly there are other countries that would fall into that category. We've seen some worrying developments in Ecuador, in Peru, In Chile too, which has given rise to a certain degree of instability in certain sectors of society. Yes, we are particularly concerned about the situation right now in the Americas. But I'll pass over to Sang-Yeon for any further comments he may have.
Thank you. One of the crucial the observation we have had since we start to work on this ILO Monitor is that the labor market disruptions are very, very sensitive to how actually effectively the countries can cope with the pandemic. When we actually made a predictions for the South America, including Brazil, the last time we expected around 10.3% losses in working hours. And this time we actually increased the number by 1.5 percentage points to the 11.8%. This simply reflects the continuous difficult situation in many of the countries in the South America. So if the challenging situation continues in these countries in terms of the tackling the pandemic, we expect that the situation remains as difficult as of now, or we cannot exclude the possibility of the worsening situation in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Okay, let's now go to Nina Larsson from AFP.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. I was wondering, you mentioned in the report that young women especially are affected. If you could say a little bit more about why that is. And also, you mentioned that there's a risk of creating a lockdown generation. If you could say a bit about what you what you read into that term. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Well, on the gender dimension of the youth employment situation, the first point is, of course, to reiterate what I said about the starting point. Pre-pandemic, women are disadvantaged on about every indicator you can look at in the labor market, and that applies particularly strongly to young women. Now, the impact in the course of the pandemic, I think we've seen multiple impacts, quite honestly. Women are particularly affected by the loss of hours, I think, and Sang-Yeon will confirm that figure. But we're also seeing, I think, in the course of this pandemic, for different reasons and because of the nature of this crisis, a particular emphasis on care in our societies and the care economy. And we know two things. One is that women and young women take up a particularly high proportion of the burden of care. They're also highly represented in the frontline activities, social care, healthcare. And so they're being hit very, very hard in these areas. But I could continue. Women are highly represented in the informal economy, which is being hard hit. Women are highly represented in the 4 strongly hit sectors. So all of these things combine, I think, to put women in this situation of even greater disadvantage as a result of the pandemic. Now, what does this sort of catchphrase of a lockdown generation attempt to convey? We've been speaking, haven't we? It almost seems like for a generation of a lost generation. That is to say, young people who face the danger of permanent exclusion from labor markets. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier on, that pre-pandemic 2019, end of 2019, levels of youth employment in the world were higher than they were before the financial crisis of 2008. So there's a lot of young people, including the alarmingly high number of so-called NEETs, who face this marginalization from the world of work and marginalization from society. I think the danger right now is that because of the 3 factors which I have tried to set out to you and are contained in our monitor, that is to say, the loss of work by young people who were currently in the world of work, the interruption of education and training with the potential for a permanent loss of such education and training, and then the almost insuperable obstacles that many young people will face to making a first entry into the labor market, we run the risk of creating a situation in this sort of snapshot of pandemic, which will have lasting effects. Now, as we recover from pandemics, well, a lot of young people are simply going to be left behind in big numbers. And the danger is, and again, this is the lesson of past experience, is that this initial shock to young people will last a decade or longer than a decade. It will affect the trajectory of working people, young working people, throughout their working lives. So it will be people who will be permanently scarred by the immediate effect of the pandemic. And I want to reiterate again that if it is indeed the case that more than half of young people today, as a direct consequence of the conditions of the pandemic, are vulnerable to anxiety and depression, well, clearly this is going to also have a contributory impact to their future professional careers. And we do need to focus all of our efforts as we put together post-pandemic policies. We really have to prioritize and invest in the situation of young people. This is a notion behind a so-called lockdown generation.
Thank you, TG. On the gender difference in the unemployment, and as I mentioned, that we are now analyzing the survey data at this stage. But as I briefly mentioned before, the latest labor force survey data from the advanced countries are clearly indicating that the women are in a very difficult situation, even compared to the male counterpart in terms of the labor market disruptions. So we continue to monitor and then report to you in the forthcoming monitor. Why actually this is the case? I mean, there are many reasons why actually young people are particularly vulnerable to this the labor market disruption. There are many reasons. Actually, this is something we are looking at. Also, we provide some answers in our new policy brief on youth employment, which will come out actually immediately after this press conference. First one is that as you may remember very well, even before the pandemic, there is the large increases in the new forms of employment, like a gig economy. You can imagine all of this. And some of this actually, the platform economy is flourishing, but at the same time, the others are suffering a lot. And so I think these young people are particularly disproportionately represented in these types of employment. So they have a relatively low job security. Another important thing we mentioned in the ILO Monitor this edition is that if we look at the sectors which are particularly hit by the pandemic, so for example, wholesale and retail and accommodation and food services, and you can imagine that's where young people are overly represented. That's why they are very vulnerable. So that actually explains why actually young people are having a particularly difficult time right now. We didn't report some interesting survey result because we are still looking at it, but just giving some idea about the current situation. As the ILO Monitor said, the young people who used to work before the pandemic began, around 17% actually stopped working. But if you look at the age group a bit older than that, like 30 and 39, this group, actually only 10% of these the people actually stop working. So you can see the difference. I mean, so I think this difference is coming out very strongly. Our concern is that this difference may come out much stronger and much more painfully if this situation continues for the coming months. And just quickly on the lockdown generation, as far as our analysis is concerned, as our Director General highlighted very clearly, this crisis is very different in a sense from the previous crisis in one important way. The financial crisis is more about what we call the labor demand shock. There's a lack of job opportunities. But this time, this is combined with the supply shock as well, because young people may not have the good opportunity to continue or pursue the training and education opportunities, which will actually help them to pursue much better actually labor market opportunities in the near future. So they are not prepared for the future opportunity at the moment. So that is really worrisome. So once you have all this together, probably the overall situation for young people will be much harder than any typical crisis, so to speak. Thank you.
Yes? Do you hear me? Ah, sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah, okay. So thank you for taking my questions, and it's very nice to see you all. If you can elaborate a little bit on Mexico, one of the countries that is doing the least number of tests, and the government is in direct confrontation with employers in the private sector. So for me, it looks like kind of bleak, but what is your opinion? And another question, more general, is that the region, Latin America, it's a very young region. There's a lot of youth people there. And so do you fear of social unrest if there's no, something doing by the government to save them? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. I'm going to take the general question, and for the details on Mexico, apart from a couple of general comments I could make, I'll pass over again to Sang-Gyeon. Yeah, Latin America is a relatively young continent. Of course, in global terms, Africa is the youngest. And if you look at South Asia, you've also got high concentrations of young people. You know, for all of the logic of this monitor, we have to be very concerned about this coincidence of strongly youthful populations, high informal economies, limited capacities for testing and tracing. And I don't want to call it a perfect storm, but it is a combination of circumstances which I think combine to lead us to this concern that labor market outcomes could be particularly damaging and long lasting. So I follow the logic of the question that we are in a particularly delicate situation here. The question of instability. Look, I have to say, if I'm allowed a personal reflection, positively surprised by the extent to which populations, citizens around the world have been willing, with greater or lesser enthusiasm, to accept the restrictions that this pandemic has imposed upon us. I think people are willing to do that and accept it, however painful, because these restrictions are regarded as necessary, proportionate, and appropriate. And where that is the case, my impression is that people will play by the rules, if I can put it like that. I think things get more difficult when there is a lack of confidence or a loss of confidence by citizens in the policy measures being taken by governments, their fairness and their effectiveness. Where that might happen, then I think you have to worry. In a situation where people's livelihoods are being placed in jeopardy to the extent that they are right now, then obviously there has to be concern about how people will react, and eventually the stability that we will not see from that. So yes, these have to enter into our considerations. And we see from everything we observe around the world that there are situations of tension, sometimes of considerable tension around the world. And I think this only must concentrate our attention and our minds on getting these difficult policy responses right, getting the health response right, getting the social and economic response right, and then building back better from this pandemic. These are the three axes of policy that the United Nations is pursuing. It's what Secretary General Guterres has emphasized. And I think that citizens will respond to that type of policy agenda if they see it being carried out equitably, fairly, and effectively. On the more specific circumstances in Mexico, Sang-Gyeon, I hope you've got the figures to hand.
I don't have picture, I'm afraid, but when we one of the underlying motivation of this analysis is not actually looking at what specific the measures the government's in taking in coping with the pandemic. Of course, when we're looking at this whole the evolution of the measures, we certainly see that the global community as a whole was not fully ready for actually tackling this pandemic through this testing and tracing, as we know, in terms of the method and the technique, and also in terms of resources, as the Director General highlighted. What we're trying to say here is that now we are trying to looking for some of the policies in which actually somehow supporting workers and business to get back to business and the work. And then we try to understand what kind of condition will be needed. We're looking at all different policy dimensions. One thing we look at it is the potential role of the testing and tracing. And so in that respect, we look at also the cost aspect as well. For example, the Republic of Korea and Iceland, these are two countries who have relatively well known for effective testing and tracing. And we calculated the cost of it, and it's less than 1% of GDP. To compare to the economic shock, we're talking about sometimes 2-digit losses in the economic output. Now, this actually, the total cost for testing and tracing is less than 1%. So if there is some good dialogue and consultation and good actual solidarity within the countries and within global communities, we think, in terms of cost, we think this is something doable. And it is very important to create, the good understanding about this. And also, if I can say so, creating a bit of the political and social solidarity to work together on that. I think this is something doable. That's what our analysis indicated.
Thank you, Sanjan. Let's now go to Lisa Schlein from Voice of America, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much for taking my question. At first, I'd like to know what age range you're talking about when you speak about youth. Who are the youth? And it seems to me that very often the adults, so-called adults in the room, forget that the youth eventually become adults themselves. So when you talk about the lockdown generation or the lost generation, this lost generation, they grow out of being young people and they become older people, what ultimately are the costs to society, the economic and all the emotional and other costs to society. Then another question I have is, Sanjan, is it Sanjan Lee, by the way, or is it Lee Sanjan? Sorry. Okay. When he was talking about the United States, I think, is it 14 million young people out of 20 million unemployed? Is that correct? But he mentioned that some countries were showing a modest improvement in youth unemployment. If you could mention those countries and if they do indeed exist, and what are they doing that is right? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, DJ, I think there's a problem with the let me. Hi, can you hear the DG?
Is it okay now?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, up to 25 years of age. And you're right, by by the nature of life, young people become less young people. The problem is people who happen to be, the unlucky cohort, as some analysts have called it, the scars that they receive when they were young people, young workers making this difficult entry into the labor force, these will stay with them throughout working life, or at least for a very large part of their working life. And this is why I think that the situation we're drawing attention to is so particularly dramatic. So those are my general points, but again, Sang-Yeon can take you through the US figures and others.
Yeah, thank you. Just adding to the what actually Director General just said, that the this actually the crisis impact on young people will stay with them throughout their working life. That's why we are worried about this. That's why we're talking about lockdown generation. If you consider, for example, the previous financial crisis, 2008 and 9, and there are interesting studies actually to compare what happens to the young people who actually managed to keep the job during the crisis and the people who lost the job. And then to see what is happening to those actually different two groups of young people next 10 years and 15 years also. One of the critical finding is that those people who actually lost job during the crisis never recover to the situation where actually the people who managed to get the job, keep the jobs actually had. So in terms of employment opportunity, they are more likely to be unemployed again, and also the income will be much less than those people who actually kept the job. It's around between 20 and 30%. They never managed to reduce that gap. That's why we are very much worried about this scarring effect, as the Director General mentioned. And the US figures, so we actually mentions these figures in the ILO Monitor. So I think if we explain that on the page 10, so I don't want to repeat all these numbers. But in terms of policy measures, many countries, including European countries and also the Asian countries, where they had a similar high concern about youth unemployment, they are doing two things. I mean, not probably in a perfect manner, but they're trying to do something. One is on trying to minimize disruption into training education through using some of the distance learning or the digital skills, and also offering some alternative way of the learning and training. The second is that they're trying to develop some program like the employment guarantee schemes, as the European Union introduced after the previous financial crisis. And also there are very specific income and the employment support for young people as part of a stimulus package many countries are developing. So I think there are quite a good actually package of the policy options for the consideration. In my view, actually, these policies make a big difference for young people.
Thank you, Sang-Yeon. Let's go to Carl Mauder from ARD Radio, please.
Thank you for taking my question. One question would be clarifying the age, because I found in the file you sent 18 till 29, and if I understood on page 11 in one chart, maybe this is just regarding this one chart, but my real question would be if you could give maybe a general picture of about the situation in Europe. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, for those points, I'm going to ask Sang-Yeon to respond.
Yeah, thank you. That's our standard definition of the young people is, of course, between the 15 and 24. But we want to understand what happened to young people in terms of labor market opportunities and situation, and in both actually the developing and advanced countries. So as you know, the many young people in advanced countries, they finish their education until early 20s and then entering labor market. So that's why we actually expanded the age group a little bit up to the 28. So that is a bit of the capturing the labor market reality. So that's why we actually specify the age group in the ILO Monitor.
Europe? You asked about Europe. Yeah, Europe. I asked about Europe. Sorry, no, asked a bit about Europe, information on Europe.
Oh yeah, of course. We have all the information in Europe as well. But we can actually send us some information separated to you if you are interested. In overall situation in Europe, as you can see, some countries like Italy and Spain, and the Greece, and also the recently in the UK, we're still waiting for the final official statistics on this. But according to our survey data, it's not the overall situation is not very good. In the UK, as you know very well, they're already talking about the difficult situation for young people, and they're using the term like the lost generation, like in the 1980s. And so also the other countries are talking about the similar challenges like in the previous financial crisis. So if there is some specific interest in the specific countries in terms of data and also our analysis, I'll be more than happy to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sang-Jun. Yeah, like Sang-Jun said, if you have any technical questions on any of the content of the monitor, send us an email, please, to newsroom@ilo.org, and we'll put you in touch with an expert. Let's now go to Maya Plents from the UN brief, please.
Thank you very much for taking my question, Director General. My question is regarding the exclusion of young women from the labor market, given the COVID-19 crisis, and how much that is related to the gender digital divide. Is there anything indicating in your monitor, and also what kind of policy guidelines? Because we know that higher income countries, the youth does have access to the internet, to broadband, to high-speed internet, and therefore can continue to attend school and take training classes online. If you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, perhaps two things to say in response to that question. The first thing of a general nature is that clearly the digital divide is a contributory factor in a general way to the disadvantages faced by women in labor markets. That's a pre-existing condition. But I think this comes to the fore in a specific way in the context of the pandemic, and this is picked up in the monitor when it relates to access to education and training. We have presented the evidence which shows that whilst there has been a very severe interruption of normal education and training activities, there has been quite a strong migration to online distance training. The figure we give, I think, is that 2/3 of training now taking place is at distance. I'm correct, Sang-Gyeon. Now, the problem there, of course, is that if you don't have access to the necessary connectivity, hardware and software, you're going to be even further disadvantaged in terms of access to education and training. This has a clear impact for low-income countries and also for low-income households, even in relatively rich countries. So there is an effect of exclusion here, which I think will have a gender dimension and will simply accumulate on top of pre-existing factors of disadvantage.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Let's go to John Zaracostas, please. John, over to you.
Yes, good morning, Guy and Mr. Lee. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on, you mentioned the youth are heavily affected in the retail sector. If you have some examples from countries where you do have data, even provisionally, for the time being. And secondly, I was wondering, in the 4 affected areas, the most affected that you've mentioned in the past, you haven't related to them in detail in this update. I was wondering, to what extent is the situation being aggravated by the cancellation of orders? I know the ILO is in dialogue with some sectors for companies to honor the orders in that have already been booked.
I'll ask Sang-Gyeon perhaps to deal with your other point on the most severely affected sectors, and retail and wholesale in particular. Yeah, one of the obviously most dramatic impacts, transmission vectors, if you like, of the pandemic to the world of work has been along extended supply chains. Mostly we tend to see it in terms of the interruption of the supply of essential goods, medical goods, surgical masks, etc. But if you look at it from the other end of the supply chain, what does it mean when these major brands, these household names on our high streets in Western Europe or the United States or Japan simply cancel orders because their shops have closed down. Well, that feeds back along supply chains and means that the garment and textile workers, be they in Bangladesh or Cambodia or wherever it might be, their employment is sort of turned off overnight. And these are people who, by and large, do not have even fundamental social protection coverage. So the example of Bangladesh is one which I know you're familiar with and that we are working hard on here in the ILO. 4 million garment workers in Bangladesh who depend on orders placed in richer countries, if I can put it as simply as that. They're out of a job. I mean, they're simply got no work to do and no income coming in. And the question then arises, well, you know, what level of responsibility should be borne, not simply by the local actors in Bangladesh, the government, etc., but by other actors along the global supply chain. And one thing that the ILO has been able to assist in this regard is by facilitating an international agreement by the two sides of industry, led by the International Organization of Employers and the International Trade Union Confederation, an agreement which has now been adhered to, I think, by some 70 actors in the garment industry supply chain, which basically says that we need, firstly, to put in place, through cost-sharing arrangements, adequate social protection measures, that yes, to answer your immediate question, buyers should honor contracts which they had already placed, because this is one of the problems. Even where buyers had placed orders and production was underway, and of course the manufacturers had incurred costs in that regard, some buyers were saying we're not in a position to, or we do not wish to pay for those goods. So in effect, goods already contracted for were simply not being paid for. This agreement would involve the buyers actually paying for those contracted obligations. And I think this in a way is one way of tackling what are undoubtedly a broader set of issues in respect of global supply chains. And I'll pass it over to Sang-Yeon for the sectoral questions more in detail.
If we look at the wholesale and retail and also the accommodation and food service together, we are basically talking about more than 20% of young youth employment. And they are particularly hit actually strongly by the pandemic. And so we look at some of the regional variation on that. I mean, across the border, I mean, especially it's very strong in Asia, in Europe, and in America, but it's across border. The impact is quite strong. And another thing I want to mention here is that on the top of this actually heavy job losses, that these workers are really sort of frontline in terms of the vulnerabilities to the pandemics. These people are providing all the services and also involving face-to-face kind of services. And so these people are particularly exposed to the pandemic. And in the recently, all the new cases from some countries are indeed actually found in some place like the call center or the food services and all retail sectors. So we are particularly worried about the young people in that perspective in terms of both the job losses risk and at the same time the health concerns. And of course, as you know very well, these sectors are typically having a large proportion of the precarious or the vulnerable employment in terms of the job security and also the income.
Thank you. We have John, you want to come back on a quick follow-up? Over to you, please.
Yeah. Coming back to the manufacturing in these areas, did your data show what percentage are young women? And I think if I heard you right, you've extended the definition from 16 to 25, from 16 to 28. Is that correct? Does that apply to all sectors, not only services, but also manufacturing? Or did I get it wrong?
Yeah. I'll ask Sang-Yeon to just clarify, please.
Apart from this actual survey, as I explained, in terms of purpose of the survey, all other data are based on the standard definition of the 15 to 24.
Which survey? Can you just explain which survey you're referring to?
The survey, the youth survey, as we reported, the ILO special global survey on youth employment, in which actually we reported that the around the over 1 in 6 actually young people actually reported that they stopped working since the pandemic began. Hope this is clear.
That's the only place.
That's the only actually the age group we use that.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we come to a close. Thank you, DG and Sangjun, for your time, and thank you, colleagues, for joining us once again for the launch of the ILO Monitor. If you have any other questions or if you would like to speak to an expert, please get in touch with us at newsroom@ilo.org. The video of the press briefing will be sent to you, and the audio as well. That will be sent right away. And just a reminder that the embargo lifts at midday GMT. That's 2 o'clock Central European time. Thank you very much. Have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.